Sometimes the worst betrayal comes from those who should love us most. Sometimes salvation arrives when we least expect it, from the most unlikely source. In ancient Scandinavia, Sigrid was buried alive by her own brothers for loving the wrong man. Her desperate cries echoed through the forest as she clawed at the dirt above her head. But Gunnar heard those cries. This giant Viking warrior had returned home after decades of raiding, seeking peace in his old age. When he pulled her from that grave, he saved more than her life. He discovered his own purpose again. Their bond would challenge everything their village believed about family, honor, and forgiveness. Gunnar's act of mercy sparked a conflict between the old brutal ways and something new. But would protecting one woman be worth standing against an entire community? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Gunnar Eriksson stood at the edge of his ancestral village, watching the sun struggle through clouds that seemed perpetually grey in this harsh northern land. 30 winters had passed since he'd last seen these familiar shores, 30 seasons of blood and gold, and the endless crash of waves against foreign coastlines. Now, at 53, his massive frame bore the weight of countless battles, and his once golden beard had turned the colour of winter frost. His battle-worn axe hung unused on the wall of his modest dwelling, its iron head still sharp, but gathering dust like a relic of a man he no longer wished to be. The weapon had served him well through 3 decades of Viking raids, from the monasteries of Ireland to the trading posts of Byzantium. It had carved his reputation in blood and bone, earning him wealth enough to live comfortably, and scars enough to remind him of the cost. But Gunnar had returned to Nordheim not as a conqueror, but as a penitent. The village had changed little in his absence. The same wooden longhouses lined the narrow paths, their thatched roofs dark with age and weather. Smoke rose from countless hearths, carrying the familiar scents of burning pine and cooking fish. The harbour remained busy with fishing boats and the occasional trading vessel, though the great longships of his youth were fewer now. Times were changing, even here in this remote corner of Norway, but some things never changed. The old ways still ruled with iron certainty. Honor above all. Family blood thicker than any bond. A woman's virtue more precious than her life, and any stain upon it requiring cleansing no matter the cost. Gunnar had learned these lessons as a boy, watching his own father enforce the ancient codes with brutal efficiency. He'd seen neighbors cast out for lesser offenses, witnessed families torn apart by rigid adherence to tradition. As a young man, he'd accepted it all without question, even participated when duty demanded. It was only during his long years away, seeing different peoples and their customs, that doubt had begun to creep into his heart like morning fog. The village spoke often of Sigrid Bjornsdottir these days, though always in hushed tones and sidelong glances. She was barely 22, the daughter of a respected farmer who died 2 winters past, leaving her in the care of her 3 brothers. By all accounts, she'd been a dutiful daughter until this summer, helping with the harvest, tending the livestock, and accepting the marriage proposals her brothers brought before her with quiet resignation. Then Erik Thorson had arrived. The whispers said he was handsome in the way that made sensible women forget their place, tall and lean with eyes like summer sky and a voice that could charm birds from trees. He came as a trader from the West Fjords, a clan that had feuded with Nordheim's families for generations over fishing rights and territorial disputes. The animosity ran so deep that even commerce between the regions was conducted with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. But love, Gunnar reflected as he walked the familiar paths of his youth, had never respected the boundaries men drew on maps or in their hearts. Erik had stayed longer than any trader should, finding excuses to extend his visit, returning day after day to Sigrid's family farm, ostensibly to negotiate for grain and wool. The brothers had welcomed his silver at first, pleased to get good prices for their goods. They'd failed to notice, or perhaps willfully ignored, the way their sister's eyes lit up when the young trader appeared, or how she began taking extra care with her appearance on market days. The affair, when it finally bloomed, had been conducted with the desperate secrecy of two people who knew their love could only bring destruction. They met in hidden corners of the forest, in the ruins of old shrines where the gods of their grandfathers were slowly being forgotten. For 3 months, they'd stolen moments together like thieves hoarding forbidden treasure. Astrid the Wise, the village's elderly seer, had been the first to notice the change in Sigrid. Women, she often said, could see what men missed: the glow of secret happiness, the tremor of barely contained joy. She'd kept the girl's secret as long as she could, but secrets in small villages were like cracks in ice. They spread until the whole surface shattered. Bjorn Bjornsson, the eldest of Sigrid's brothers, had discovered the truth 3 days ago. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the essence remained constant. He'd followed his sister into the woods and found her in Eric's arms. The young trader had fled rather than face immediate death, promising to return for her once he'd finished his trading voyage to the southern settlements. What followed had been predictable in its brutality. Bjorn, supported by his younger brothers, Olaf and Magnus, had dragged Sigrid before the village elders. The accusation was simple. She had dishonored their family name by consorting with an enemy, betraying not just blood, but the very foundations of their community's identity. The traditional punishment for such transgression was clear: death, usually by drowning or burning, depending on the severity of the shame brought upon the family. But Sigrid had refused to repent, refused to renounce her love for Eric, refused to beg forgiveness for following her heart. Her defiance had only made her brother's rage burn hotter. It was Magnus, the youngest at barely 18, who'd suggested the buried-alive punishment. Let her think about her choices, he'd argued, as the earth pressed down upon her chest. Let her final moments be spent in darkness and terror, contemplating the destruction her selfish desires had brought upon them all. The village had gathered yesterday morning to witness the execution. Gunnar had watched from a distance, his stomach churning with memories of similar scenes from his youth. He'd seen the crude wooden box they'd forced her into, heard her muffled pleas for mercy as they began shoveling dirt over the makeshift coffin. Most of the villagers had stayed until the sounds stopped, as if their presence somehow sanctified the brutality. But Gunnar had turned away before the end, unable to bear the sight of another life snuffed out in the name of honor. He'd spent the rest of the day and most of the night walking the hills above the village, wrestling with ghosts that 30 years of violence had carved into his soul. Now, as dawn broke over the familiar landscape of his childhood, Gunnar found himself drawn toward the forest, where the execution had taken place. He told himself he was simply gathering firewood for the approaching winter, but his feet carried him unerringly toward the patch of disturbed earth where Sigrid Bjornsdottir lay entombed. The silence of the northern woods was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of ravens. Gunnar's massive hands moved methodically, gathering fallen branches and stacking them in neat piles. The work was peaceful, meditative, so different from the chaos of battle that had defined most of his adult life. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination, a rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat amplified through earth and stone. He paused, his scarred hands still gripping a piece of deadwood, and listened with the intensity that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. There it was again, definitely not imagination. Someone was alive beneath the ground, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the darkness that others had chosen for them. Gunnar dropped the firewood and fell to his knees beside the burial mound, pressing his ear to the packed earth. The sounds were growing weaker, more desperate. Whoever lay beneath was running out of time and strength, but they hadn't given up. That stubborn refusal to yield resonated in Gunnar's chest like the first note of a song he'd thought he'd forgotten. His massive hands began clawing at the dirt with desperate efficiency, throwing aside clods of earth with the same focused intensity he'd once brought to battle. The sound grew stronger as he dug, revealing itself to be the frantic scratching of fingernails against wood, the muffled gasps of someone suffocating in their own grave. "Hold on," he whispered to the earth, though he doubted his voice could penetrate the packed soil. "Hold on, I'm coming." The wooden box lay barely 3 feet down, a hasty grave, built more for expedience than permanence. Gunnar's powerful arms made quick work of the remaining dirt, and soon he could see the crude planks that formed the makeshift coffin. The sounds from within were weaker now, more sporadic, as if the person inside was losing the strength to fight. With a grunt of effort, Gunnar wedged his fingers between the boards and pulled. The wood, green and hastily assembled, came apart with a crack that echoed through the forest, like breaking bones. Dirt cascaded into the opening, and suddenly he could see her, Sigrid Bjornsdottir, barely conscious, her face streaked with earth and tears, a torn piece of linen burial shroud clutched in her trembling fist. She looked up at him with eyes that held more than fear. They held the wild, desperate hope of someone who'd already accepted death, but found themselves unexpectedly reprieved. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Gunnar reached down with gentle hands that had dealt so much death, and carefully lifted her from her premature grave. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. "You're safe." Sigrid tried to speak but could only manage a whispered, "Why?" before exhaustion claimed her consciousness. Gunnar gathered her carefully in his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. The torn burial shroud she clutched seemed to flutter in the morning breeze like a banner of survival. As he carried her through the forest toward his dwelling, Gunnar felt something shift inside his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps this was why the gods had brought him home after so long, not for peace or penance, but for this moment, this choice, this chance to save instead of destroy. Behind them, the empty grave yawned like a mouth that had been cheated of its meal. Soon, the village would know what he'd done. Soon, he would have to face the consequences of defying their ancient ways. But for now, in the quiet of the morning forest, Gunnar Eriksson walked home with a life he'd saved, feeling more like himself than he had in 30 years. The dawn that would seal Sigrid's fate had begun with her brothers standing outside her sleeping chamber, their faces carved from stone and wind. Bjorn held the family's ceremonial bonds, thick ropes their grandfather had used for similar purposes, while Olaf clutched a wooden gag, worn smooth by generations of shameful necessity. Magnus, barely past boyhood himself, carried the hammer and nails that would seal her coffin. "Get up," Bjorn commanded, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once made him the brother she'd run to with scraped knees and broken toys. "The village waits." Sigrid had known this morning would come since the moment Bjorn discovered her secret in the forest 3 days prior. She'd seen it in his eyes when he'd dragged her home, not just anger, but something colder. The look of a man who'd found a diseased limb that required cutting away to save the whole body. She rose from her straw mattress without protest, her fingers automatically going to the small silver pendant that hung at her throat. Eric had given it to her on their last meeting, a simple piece shaped like 2 hands, clasped in eternal union. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. "You still wear his token of shame," Olaf observed, his young voice cracking with disgust. At 20, he'd always been the most rigid of her brothers, desperate to prove his manhood through unwavering adherence to tradition. "I wear a symbol of love," Sigrid replied quietly, her fingers tightening protectively around the pendant. "Something you've never known and likely never will." The slap came so quickly she barely saw Bjorn's hand move. The force of it sent her sprawling backward, her cheek burning with the imprint of his palm. Blood trickled from her split lip, tasting of copper and finality. "Love?" Bjorn's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. You call your betrayal love? You've brought shame on our father's memory, on our bloodline, on everything we've built in this community. That trader used you like a common whore, and you were too foolish to see it. Sigrid wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, meeting her brother's gaze without flinching. Eric loves me, he'll return for me. Eric fled like the coward he is, Magnus said, his voice tight with nervous energy. He saw real men approaching and ran back to his own people, leaving you to face the consequences alone. But Sigrid shook her head, clutching the pendant tighter. Even now, even facing death, she refused to believe Eric had abandoned her. She'd seen the truth in his eyes during their stolen moments together, the way he'd held her as if she was something precious beyond measure. The promises he'd whispered against her hair when he thought no one could hear. The walk to the burial site had been a procession of shame. Half the village followed, their faces a mixture of righteous satisfaction and uncomfortable duty. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at witnessing such adult consequences. The elderly nodded approval, remembering similar cleansings from their own youth. Astrid the Wise walked among them, her ancient face creased with sorrow that she tried to hide. The old woman had always been kind to Sigrid, teaching her healing herbs and the old songs their grandmothers had sung. Now she could only watch as another young life was sacrificed to the inexorable demands of tradition. The coffin waited in the forest, clearing like a hungry mouth. Magnus had built it hastily but thoroughly green pine boards, nailed together with gaps barely wide enough for air to seep through. It was meant to prolong suffering, not prevent it. The cruelty was intentional, designed to give the condemned time to contemplate their choices as the earth pressed down and breathing became increasingly difficult. "You have one final chance," Bjorn announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual judgment. "Renounce your shameful love. Swear before these witnesses that you reject the enemy who defiled you. Promise to live chastely in service to our family's honor, and we will grant you a clean death by drowning." The crowd waited in tense silence. Even the ravens seemed to pause their cawing, as if the forest itself held its breath for her answer. Sigrid looked at the faces surrounding her neighbors, who'd watched her grow from a laughing child to a young woman, people who'd shared meals at her family's table, the children she'd helped with their letters and numbers. None of them met her eyes now. This was justice, they told themselves. This was necessary. "I love Eric Thorson," Sigrid said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing like a bell tolling defiance. "I will love him until my last breath leaves my body, and if there's life beyond this world, I'll love him there as well. Nothing you do to me will change that truth." The collective intake of breath from the crowd sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Several women turned away, unable to watch what would come next. But tradition demanded witnesses, demanded that the community see the price of defying their ancient ways. Bjorn's face had gone white with rage, but his voice remained steady as granite. "Then you choose your fate. May the gods have mercy on your soul, because we cannot." They forced her into the coffin with efficient brutality. Sigrid didn't fight, what would be the point? But neither did she make it easy for them. She lay rigid as a spear shaft, her hand still clutching Eric's pendant, her eyes fixed on the patch of sky visible through the tree branches above. "Cover her face," Magnus suggested, producing a length of rough cloth. "No one should have to see." "No." Sigrid's voice cut through his words like a blade. "If you're going to murder me, at least have the courage to look me in the eyes while you do it." The first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin boards with a sound like thunder. The second followed quickly, then the third, as her brothers worked with grim efficiency to complete their grisly task. Other men from the village joined them, making the work go faster. The sooner it was finished, the sooner they could all return to their normal lives and pretend this dark morning had been just another necessary duty. Sigrid watched the growing layer of earth through the gaps between the boards, feeling each clod land like a physical blow. The weight pressed down on the coffin lid, making the green wood creak ominously. Soon the gaps would be plugged with dirt, and the air would grow thick and stale. But still she clutched Eric's pendant, feeling its smooth silver surface warm against her palm. If these were to be her final moments, she would spend them remembering love, not hatred. She would think of summer afternoons by the hidden stream where they'd shared their first kiss, of the way Eric's eyes crinkled when he laughed at her jokes, of the plans they'd made for a life together that now would never be. The last of the sky disappeared behind a curtain of earth, and Sigrid found herself in darkness more complete than anything she'd ever experienced. The air grew thick and close, each breath requiring more effort than the last. Panic clawed at her chest like a living thing, but she forced it down through sheer will. She would not give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. Instead, she began to sing softly, barely above a whisper, one of the old love songs Astrid had taught her. Her voice was muffled by earth and wood, probably inaudible to those above, but it gave her something to focus on besides, the growing weight on her chest and the decreasing space for her lungs to expand. Time became meaningless in the suffocating darkness. Minutes felt like hours, heartbeats like drum rolls, announcing the end of everything she'd ever known. The pendant in her hand grew slick with sweat, but she held it tight as an anchor to the world of light and love she was leaving behind. Above ground, the village had dispersed to their daily tasks, satisfied that justice had been served. Bjorn and his brothers returned to their farm, where they would burn their sister's possessions and speak her name no more. She had made her choice, they told themselves. They had simply honored the consequences that choice demanded. But in her earthen prison, Sigrid continued to breathe, continued to sing, continued to love. The pendant Eric had given her remained warm against her palm, a tangible reminder that some things were worth dying for, even if they weren't worth living without. She would hold on to that truth until her last breath faded into the waiting darkness. Gunnar's dwelling sat at the edge of the village like a quiet afterthought, built into a natural hollow that provided shelter from the harsh northern winds. It was modest by any measure, a single room with a stone hearth, a sleeping alcove, and enough space for a man who'd learned to live with only what he could carry. But it had something more precious than size: privacy. He laid Sigrid carefully on his own sleeping furs, her unconscious form so still he had to lean close to confirm she was still breathing. The torn burial shroud remained clutched in her fist, even in sleep, as if letting go might somehow return her to the grave. Dirt streaked her face and matted her dark hair, and her lips held the blue tinge of someone who'd come too close to suffocation. But she was alive. That was what mattered. Gunnar moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd tended wounded comrades on countless battlefields. He heated water over his fire, gathered clean cloth, and began the gentle work of washing away the evidence of her near death. Each careful movement revealed more of the person beneath the grime, a young woman barely past girlhood, with features that spoke of intelligence and determination, even in unconsciousness. As he worked, a small wooden object fell from her clothing, a carved bear no bigger than his thumb, worn smooth by countless touches. It was clearly the work of someone who loved her, crafted with the kind of patient detail that spoke of long winter evenings and careful devotion. This had to be Eric's handiwork, another token of the forbidden love that had nearly cost Sigrid her life. Gunnar set the carving carefully beside the sleeping furs, next to the torn shroud she refused to release. These small artifacts of her story seemed important somehow, tangible proof that her suffering had meaning beyond the village's rigid judgments. The first sign of her awakening came as a tremor barely visible, like wind rippling across still water. Then her breathing changed, becoming quicker and more shallow as consciousness fought its way back to the surface. Gunnar retreated to give her space, settling into his wooden chair where she could see him clearly when her eyes opened. Those eyes, when they finally focused, held the wild terror of prey that had escaped the trap but couldn't quite believe in safety. She sat up too quickly, gasping as if the air itself might be stolen from her again, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room like a cornered animal seeking escape. "Peace," Gunnar said softly, his deep voice deliberately calm and steady. "You're safe here. No one will harm you." Sigrid's hand went immediately to her throat, panic flashing across her face when she didn't find what she sought. "My pendant, Eric's pendant, here." Gunnar reached slowly for his belt pouch, producing the silver token with careful reverence. "It fell when I carried you from the forest. I kept it safe." The relief that washed over her features was profound, as if he'd returned her very soul rather than a simple piece of jewelry. She clutched the pendant to her chest, and for the first time since awakening, her breathing began to steady. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming into packed earth. "Why?" It was a question Gunnar had been asking himself since the moment he'd heard her muffled cries. The answer wasn't simple, wasn't something that could be explained in words that would satisfy either of them. Instead, he offered what truth he could. Because no one deserves to die for loving someone. Sigrid studied his weathered face, taking in the scars that mapped decades of violence, the grey beard that spoke of hard-won wisdom, the gentle hands that seemed too large for such careful movements. "You're Gunnar Eriksson, the raider. I remember stories about you from when I was small. I'm just a man trying to find his way home," Gunnar replied. "The same as anyone." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working nervously at Eric's pendant while she processed everything that had happened. "My brothers will come for me. They'll say you're harboring a criminal, that you're defying the village's justice. Let them come." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to surprise her. She'd expected hesitation, perhaps even second thoughts about the enormity of what he'd done. Instead, she found the kind of quiet resolve that could move mountains or hold back avalanches through sheer determination. "You don't understand," Sigrid insisted, struggling to make him see the danger he'd placed himself in. "Bjorn won't let this stand. He's already shamed by what I did. If word spreads that someone rescued me, that the punishment failed. Your only crime was loving someone your family disapproved of." Gunnar interrupted gently. "That's not worth dying for. It is in their eyes, in the village's eyes." Sigrid's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been judged and found wanting by everyone she'd ever known. "I brought dishonor to our name. I chose an enemy over my own blood. You chose your heart over their hatred," Gunnar said firmly. "There's no shame in that." The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. No one had spoken to her with such understanding since Eric's departure. Everyone else, her brothers, the village elders, even some of the women who'd once been friends, had looked at her as something diseased, something that needed to be cut away for the health of the whole community. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, not the desperate sobs of someone in immediate danger, but the deeper grief of someone who'd lost everything they'd ever believed about their place in the world. Gunnar let her cry without trying to offer comfort or empty words. Some pain could only be washed clean with salt water and time. When the tears finally subsided, Sigrid found her voice again. Eric was supposed to return 3 days ago. His trading voyage to the southern settlements should have been finished by now. Gunnar heard the hope and worry warring in her tone. The young woman still believed her lover would come back for her, would somehow make everything right, despite the impossible circumstances. It was the kind of faith that belonged to those who hadn't yet learned how often the world broke such beautiful dreams. "Trading voyages can be delayed by weather or opportunity," he offered carefully. "The southern routes are particularly unpredictable this time of year." But even as he spoke the words, Gunnar felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. 3 days late was more than weather. 3 days late, with the woman he loved facing execution, suggested something far more permanent had prevented Erik Thorson's return. "He'll come," Sigrid insisted, as if saying it firmly enough could make it true. "He promised he'd come back for me. We were going to leave together, find somewhere our family's hatred couldn't follow us." Gunnar nodded. though privately he wondered if the young trader's promise had died with him somewhere along the mountain paths that connected their communities. But Sigrid didn't need to hear such dark thoughts yet. She needed time to heal, time to find her strength again before facing whatever truths waited in the days ahead. "For now, you're safe here," he said simply. "Rest, recover. We'll face whatever comes when it arrives." Outside, the afternoon light was already fading toward evening, and Gunnar could see figures moving along the village paths, people going about their daily business, unaware that everything they thought they knew about justice and mercy was about to be challenged by an old warrior's simple act of compassion. The nightmares came with the darkness, just as Gunnar had known they would. He'd learned long ago that trauma nested in the mind like ravens in a corpse, picking at memories until sleep became another battlefield. From his place by the dying fire, he heard Sigrid's sharp intake of breath, the muffled cry that escaped her lips as she relived being buried alive. She sat up suddenly, gasping and clawing at her throat as if dirt still pressed against her windpipe. Her eyes found his in the flickering firelight, wide with the terror of someone who couldn't quite distinguish between past and present. "You're safe," Gunnar reminded her quietly, not moving from his chair. Sudden movements might only add to her panic. "You're in my dwelling. No one can reach you here." It took several long moments for her breathing to steady, for the present to reassert itself over the darkness of memory. Sigrid's fingers went automatically to Eric's pendant, using its familiar weight to anchor herself in reality. "Tell me about him," Gunnar suggested, recognizing the need to replace dark thoughts with brighter ones. "Tell me about Eric." A soft smile touched Sigrid's lips, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her. "He has the most beautiful hands, strong from his work, but gentle when he touches my face. He carves things when he's thinking little animals, mostly. Bears and wolves and ravens. He says they help him remember that there's beauty in the world, even when people forget how to see it." She reached for the small wooden bear beside her sleeping furs, running her thumb over its smooth surface with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic. "He made this for me after our first real conversation. Said it reminded him of my spirit, small but fierce, protective of what matters." Gunnar could hear the love in her voice, see it in the way her entire demeanor softened when speaking Eric's name. It was the kind of pure, uncomplicated devotion that made the village's brutal response seem even more senseless. "How did you meet?" "The spring market," Sigrid replied, settling back against her furs but keeping her eyes on the fire. "He was arguing with old Tormund about the price of barley, not angry, arguing, playful, almost, making jokes about how Tormund's scales must be blessed by the gods since they always seemed to favor the seller." She laughed softly at the memory, a sound like water over stones. "I'd never seen anyone tease Tormund and make him laugh instead of roar. Eric had this way of finding the humor in things without making people feel foolish. It was like watching someone speak a language I'd always wanted to learn." But as she spoke, Gunnar noticed the way her hand trembled slightly, how her eyes would dart toward the door whenever wind rattled the wooden frame. The confidence she'd shown in defying her brothers was still there, but it now coexisted with the bone-deep knowledge of how quickly safety could be stripped away. "My brothers were different once," she continued, as if reading his thoughts. "Bjorn used to tell me stories when storms frightened me as a child. Olaf would sneak me extra honey cakes when mother wasn't looking. Even Magnus, he was so proud when I taught him to read the old runes." Her voice grew quieter, sadder. "But when father died, something changed in them. Suddenly, everything became about honor and reputation and proving we were worthy of respect. They started seeing threats everywhere, imagining insults where none existed. It was as if they'd forgotten how to be human and could only remember how to be warriors." Gunnar understood that transformation all too well. He'd seen it happen to countless young men over the years, the way violence became easier than vulnerability, how hatred felt safer than love because it required no trust, no risk of loss. He'd lived that way himself for far too long. "I saw my daughter die," he said quietly, the words coming from some deep place he rarely allowed others to see. 20 years ago, in Ireland. She was 8 winters old, caught in a raid that went wrong. I couldn't save her." Sigrid's attention sharpened, sensing the weight of what he was sharing. Few warriors spoke openly about their failures, their moments of powerlessness. "Her name was Freydis," Gunnar continued, his eyes fixed on the ancient runestone fragment that sat on his mantle, a piece of carved rock he'd carried through 3 decades of wandering, bearing words about redemption that had once seemed impossible to achieve. "She had your spirit, fierce, uncompromising. She would have grown up to love deeply and stand by her choices, no matter the cost." "Is that why you saved me?" Sigrid asked softly. "Because I reminded you of her?" Gunnar considered the question carefully. The truth was complex, layered with years of regret and the slow, painful process of learning to see clearly again. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because I've spent 30 years taking lives. It felt good to save one for a change." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of logs and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Outside, Gunnar could hear footsteps on the path, deliberate, purposeful steps that suggested visitors rather than casual passers-by. The knock on his door came 3 times, firm but not aggressive, a formal announcement rather than a demand. "Gunnar Eriksson," called a voice he recognized as belonging to Bjorn Bjornsson. "We need to speak with you." Sigrid's face went pale, her hand instinctively reaching for the carved bear as if it might somehow protect her from what was coming. But Gunnar simply rose from his chair with the unhurried calm of a man who'd been expecting this moment since he'd first heard her cries in the forest. "Stay here," he told Sigrid quietly. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." He moved to the door but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he took a moment to center himself, to find the balance between diplomacy and determination that would be necessary for what came next. "What can I do for you, Bjorn?" he called through the wooden barrier. "You know why we're here," came the reply. "The village has questions about what happened in the forest today, about why the burial site was disturbed." Gunnar's hand rested on the door handle, feeling the weight of the moment. Once he opened this door, there would be no going back. The quiet life he'd hoped to build in his old age would be replaced by conflict and consequences he couldn't yet fully foresee. But behind him, he could hear Sigrid's quiet breathing, could sense her fear and her desperate hope that someone, finally, would stand between her and the brutal traditions that had nearly claimed her life. His choice had been made the moment he decided to dig her out of that grave. Now it was simply time to face the results. "Come in," he said, lifting the wooden bar that secured his door. "Let's talk." Bjorn Bjornsson stepped through the doorway with the measured confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to be wherever he chose to stand. Behind him came Olaf and Magnus, their faces set in identical expressions of righteous determination. The family resemblance was strong. All 3 shared the same broad shoulders and stern features that had marked their bloodline for generations. But it was the sword at Bjorn's side that drew Gunnar's attention. Not just any weapon, but the ancient blade that had belonged to their father, a piece of steel that had been passed down through 5 generations of Bjornsson men. The fact that Bjorn wore it tonight spoke of ceremony, of formal purpose that went beyond simple conversation. "You've been busy today," Bjorn said, his eyes scanning the modest dwelling with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. "The forest tells interesting stories to those who know how to read them." Gunnar remained standing near the door, his massive frame positioned casually but effectively blocking the brothers' view of the sleeping alcove where Sigrid waited in terrified silence. "I gathered firewood. Nothing more dramatic than that." "Firewood?" Olaf repeated with a bitter laugh. "Is that what we're calling grave robbery now?" Magnus, the youngest, seemed less certain than his brothers. His eyes kept darting around the room, and his hand rested nervously on his own weapon, a simple knife that looked like a toy compared to his father's inherited sword. The burial site was disturbed, Bjorn continued, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official accusation. Earth scattered, the coffin torn apart. Someone with considerable strength broke open what was meant to stay sealed. Interesting, Gunnar replied mildly. Scavengers, perhaps. The forest has many hungry creatures. But Bjorn shook his head, his expression hardening with frustrated certainty. No animal did this work. The damage was too precise, too purposeful. Someone dug down deliberately, knowing exactly what they were looking for. The tension in the room grew thicker with each exchange. Gunnar could sense Sigrid's terror radiating from the alcove behind him, could almost feel her struggle to remain silent despite every instinct screaming at her to run. But running wouldn't help her now. The only path forward lay through this confrontation. Even if that were true, Gunnar said carefully, what concern is it of yours? The matter was concluded. Justice was served according to your customs. Our customs, Magnus spoke for the first time, his young voice cracking with indignation. These are the customs of our fathers and their fathers before them. The laws that have kept our community strong and pure for countless generations. Gunnar's eyes met the young man's gaze steadily. And how well have those laws served you? How many young people have they driven away? How many families have they torn apart in the name of purity? Better a small cut to remove disease than allowing infection to spread through the whole body, Bjorn declared, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on his father's sword hilt. You've been away too long, Gunnar. You've forgotten what it means to belong to something larger than yourself. Have I? Gunnar stepped forward slightly, just enough to remind the three brothers of his considerable size advantage. Or have I learned the difference between strength and brutality? The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Olaf's face flushed red with anger, and his hand went to his own weapon. You think 30 years of raiding foreign shores gives you the right to lecture us about our own traditions? He snarled. You come back here talking about mercy and understanding, but we remember the stories. We know what you were, Gunnar Eriksson. How many villages did you burn? How many innocent people died by your hand? The accusation hit its mark, and Gunnar felt the familiar weight of old guilt settling on his shoulders like a well-worn cloak. Olaf was right, of course. The man standing before them had indeed been a monster once, had carved his reputation in blood and fire across half the known world. But that was exactly why he couldn't let this injustice continue. Every death I caused haunts me, he said quietly. Every life I took for gold or glory or the simple pleasure of proving I could. That's why I recognize the sound an innocent person makes when they're dying for someone else's idea of their honor. Innocent? Bjorn's voice rose dangerously. My sister brought shame on our family name. She consorted with our enemies, betrayed everything we stand for, chose her own selfish desires over the welfare of her community. There's nothing innocent about that. She fell in love, Gunnar replied simply, with a young man who, by all accounts, treated her with kindness and respect. The only crime here is punishing someone for following their heart. Magnus stepped forward, his youthful face twisted with confusion and hurt. You don't understand what she did to us. The whispers, the sideways looks, the way people question our honor now. She made us laughingstocks, made our father's memory a joke. For the first time, Gunnar felt genuine sympathy for the young man. Magnus was barely past childhood himself, struggling to understand a world where love could be seen as betrayal, where family loyalty demanded such terrible prices. Your father was a good man, Gunnar said gently. I knew him before I left for the raids. He valued compassion as much as strength, understanding as much as tradition. Do you really think he would have wanted his daughter to die for loving someone? Our father believed in honor above all else, Bjorn stated flatly. He taught us that some things are more important than individual happiness, family, community, the preservation of our way of life. And what kind of life is worth preserving if it requires murdering young women for loving the wrong people? Gunnar asked. The question struck home. He could see it in the way Magnus flinched, in the slight uncertainty that flickered across Olaf's features. Even Bjorn seemed to waver for a moment before his jaw tightened with renewed resolve. "Where is she, Gunnar?" Bjorn asked directly, abandoning all pretense of casual inquiry. "Where is my sister?" The moment of truth had arrived. Gunnar could feel Sigrid's presence behind him like heat from a forge, could sense her terror and her desperate hope that he would continue to protect her despite the overwhelming odds. "Safe," he said simply. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." Bjorn's hand closed fully around his father's sword hilt, the ancient metal singing softly as it cleared its scabbard. "I want my sister returned to face the consequences of her choices." What happened today was an interruption, not a conclusion. Gunnar didn't move, didn't reach for any weapon of his own. Instead, he simply stood there like a mountain that had decided not to be moved, his weathered face calm with the kind of certainty that came from finally knowing exactly where he stood. "Then you'll have to go through me first." The standoff lasted only heartbeats, but those moments stretched like years in Gunnar's mind. He could see Bjorn calculating odds, weighing his chances against a man who'd survived 3 decades of warfare. Magnus and Olaf flanked their older brother, hands on weapons but uncertainty clear in their eyes. They'd come expecting intimidation to be enough. They hadn't prepared for actual combat. "You would fight your own neighbors for a woman who's brought nothing but shame?" Bjorn asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "You would spill blood to protect someone who chose an enemy over her own family?" "I would fight to protect someone who needs protection," Gunnar replied evenly. "The rest is just words." For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then Magnus stepped back slightly, his young face pale with the realization of what they were contemplating. "Bjorn, maybe we should—" "No." Bjorn's voice cut through his brother's hesitation like an axe through kindling. "This ends tonight, one way or another." But before anyone could draw steel in earnest, a new voice cut through the tension from outside the dwelling. "Put away your weapons, all of you. This is no way for neighbors to settle disputes." Astrid the Wise appeared in the doorway, her ancient frame draped in the thick woolen cloak she wore for formal occasions. Behind her came several village elders, their faces grave with the weight of being called to witness what could become the first blood feud in Nordheim for over a generation. "Astrid," Bjorn said through gritted teeth, frustration clear in his voice, "this is family business. It doesn't concern the council. When you draw your father's sword in another man's dwelling, it becomes everyone's business." The old woman replied sharply. Her pale eyes, still sharp despite her advanced years, took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd survived 8 decades of human foolishness. She moved deeper into the room with the careful dignity of age, her gnarled hands folded before her. Hidden in the folds of her cloak, Gunnar glimpsed the amber necklace she wore only for the most solemn occasions, a piece that had belonged to her own mother and her grandmother before that. It was said to hold the wisdom of 7 generations of wise women. "I know why you're here, Bjorn Bjornsson," Astrid continued, her voice carrying the authority that came from being the keeper of the village's collective memory. "And I know what you believe you must do. But has it occurred to you to ask why a man like Gunnar Eriksson would risk everything to interfere with what you call justice?" "Because he's forgotten his place," Olaf interjected angrily. "Because he thinks his reputation as a warrior gives him the right to meddle in our affairs." Astrid's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Child, Gunnar Eriksson could have killed all 3 of you before you finished crossing his threshold. If he'd wanted to solve this with violence, you'd already be dead. The fact that you're still breathing suggests he's trying to teach you something." The words had a sobering effect on the brothers. Magnus unconsciously touched his throat, as if imagining what those massive hands could do if they chose violence over sane restraint. "What lesson could he possibly have for us?" Bjorn demanded, though some of the heat had gone out of his voice. "Perhaps," Gunnar said quietly, the lesson that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness. He moved slowly to his wooden chair and sat down, deliberately making himself less threatening while keeping his body positioned between the brothers and Sigrid's hiding place. "Tell me, Bjorn, when your father lay dying, what did he ask of you?" The question caught the eldest brother off guard. His hand loosened slightly on his sword hilt as memories forced their way to the surface. He asked us to take care of Sigrid, to protect her. "And how does burying her alive fulfill that promise?" Bjorn's face flushed red, but this time with shame rather than anger. "She brought dishonor on us all. Father would have understood." "Your father knew love when he saw it," Astrid interrupted gently. "I was at his wedding feast, watched him dance with your mother like she was the only woman in the world. He understood what it meant to choose the heart over convention." "That was different," Magnus protested. "They were from the same people, the same customs." "Sigrid chose an enemy." "Did she?" Gunnar asked. "Or did she choose a young man who treated her with kindness, who carved little tokens of affection and spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered, who saw her as more than just a vessel for her family's honor?" The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. Even Olaf seemed to be wrestling with doubts he'd previously refused to acknowledge. "You want to know where she is?" Gunnar continued, his voice growing softer but somehow more compelling. "She's here, listening to every word, probably terrified that you'll drag her back to that grave and finish what you started." Bjorn started forward, but Gunnar held up a hand. "Wait. Before you see her, before you speak to her, I want you to answer one question honestly. When you found her with Eric in the forest, what did you see?" "I saw betrayal," Bjorn replied immediately. "Look deeper, past your anger, past your hurt pride. What did you actually see?" For a long moment, Bjorn struggled with the question. His brothers watched him, waiting for the certainty that had always defined their older sibling. But when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw her smiling, really smiling, for the first time since Father died. She looked happy." "And that frightened you," Astrid observed gently, "because happiness meant she might leave, might choose her own path instead of the one you'd planned for her." "We're all she has left," Magnus said desperately. "If she goes with him, if she chooses his people over ours, we lose her forever." "And if you kill her for loving him," Gunnar replied, "you lose her anyway. But this way, everyone gets to live with the consequences of your choices." The weight of that truth settled over the brothers like a cold fog. For the first time, they seemed to truly understand what they'd almost done, not just to Sigrid, but to themselves and the memory of the father they claimed to honor. "Let me talk to her," Bjorn said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. Let me apologize." Gunnar studied the young man's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or lingering violence. What he saw instead was the beginning of something that might, with time and patience, grow into wisdom. "Sigrid," he called softly toward the alcove, "your brothers want to speak with you. Are you willing to listen?" The silence stretched long enough that Gunnar began to wonder if she would refuse. Then, slowly, Sigrid emerged from her hiding place, clutching Eric's amber necklace like a talisman against the pain that was sure to come. Sigrid emerged from the alcove like a ghost made flesh, her face pale but determined. The amber necklace caught the firelight as she moved, casting warm shadows that seemed to dance with memories of her mother's gentle touch. For a moment, the brothers simply stared at her, this sister they'd thought dead, now standing before them like an accusation given form. "Sigrid," Bjorn whispered, his voice breaking on her name. She held herself with careful dignity, but Gunnar could see the tremor in her hands, the way she kept one shoulder pressed against the wall for support. The trauma of her near death was still fresh, still visible in the careful way she breathed, as if she couldn't quite believe air would continue to fill her lungs. "Hello, brothers," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to see me again. I know my continued existence complicates your sense of justice." The bitter words hit their mark. Magnus actually flinched, while Olaf's face crumpled with something that might have been shame. But it was Bjorn's reaction that surprised everyone. The fierce, uncompromising eldest brother, whose certainty had driven them all to this moment, suddenly looked like a lost child. "We thought," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words for what they'd convinced themselves was necessary. "We believed it was the only way to restore our honor." "Your honor," Sigrid repeated softly. "Tell me, Bjorn, did burying me alive make you feel honorable? Did shoveling dirt onto my face restore your standing in the community?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered up the path outside. Heavy, urgent hoofbeats that spoke of desperate haste and terrible news. A horse and rider pushed hard through the night, driven by something that couldn't wait for morning. Astrid moved to the window, her ancient eyes peering through the darkness. "It's Torkel, the merchant," she announced, her voice tight with foreboding. "He's riding like the wolves of Ragnarok are snapping at his heels." The merchant burst through the door without invitation, his face wild with exhaustion and something deeper, the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd seen death and barely escaped it himself. His clothes were torn, his horse lathered with foam, and his hands shook as he struggled to catch his breath. "Erik Thorson," he gasped, the name falling into the room like a stone into still water. "The trader from the Westfjords. I found him 3 days' ride south of here, in the mountain pass near Eagle's Crag." Sigrid's face went white as fresh snow. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, finding Eric's pendant and clutching it like a lifeline. "Found him? What do you mean, found him?" Torkel's eyes found hers, and the pity in his gaze was answer enough. But he spoke the words anyway, each one falling like a hammer blow against an anvil. "He's dead, girl. Murdered. Left to rot beside the trading path, like carrion for the ravens." The silence that followed was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something too terrible for immediate comprehension. Sigrid's knees buckled, and only Gunnar's quick reflexes kept her from hitting the floor. She clung to his massive arm, her world tilting on its axis as the future she'd been clinging to crumbled like ash in her fingers. "How?" Bjorn's voice was barely audible. Torkel pulled a blood-stained bundle from his travel pack, a familiar wool cloak that had once kept Erik warm during cold mountain nights. Now it bore the dark evidence of violence, tears that could only have come from blade wounds. Ambushed. By the look of it, his purse was still full, so it wasn't robbery. Someone wanted him dead specifically, wanted to make sure he never completed his journey. Gunnar felt something cold and terrible settling in his chest. 3 days' ride south. That meant Erik had been killed before Sigrid's trial, before her burial. While she was fighting for her life in that wooden box, the man she loved was already lying dead in the mountains. "When?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. 4 days ago, maybe 5. Hard to tell exactly, but the wounds were fresh when the ravens found him. The timing struck everyone in the room like a physical blow. Erik hadn't abandoned Sigrid or failed to return for her. He'd been murdered while trying to reach her, killed by someone who knew exactly when and where to find him. Sigrid looked up from Gunnar's arms, her eyes finding her brothers' faces with dawning horror. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew he was dead when you buried me. You knew he wasn't coming back." "No," Magnus said quickly, his young face desperate with the need to deny what everyone was beginning to understand. "We didn't know anything. We were just following orders," Olaf finished quietly, his voice heavy with realization. But Bjorn's silence spoke louder than any denial. He stood frozen, his father's sword hanging forgotten at his side, his face a mask of growing comprehension and horror. Slowly, inevitably, all eyes turned to him. "Bjorn," Astrid said carefully, her ancient voice cutting through the tension like a blade through cloth. "What did you do?" For a long moment, the eldest brother said nothing. Then, as if the words were being dragged from his throat by iron hooks, he began to speak. "I couldn't let him take her. Couldn't let our family's shame spread to other communities when people learned what kind of woman she'd become. So I sent word to Ragnar One-Eye and his men. Told them when Eric would be traveling the mountain pass, told them he was carrying information about our defenses to his people. The confession hit the room like a lightning strike. Even Olaf and Magnus stared at their brother in shocked disbelief, finally understanding the full scope of what had been done in their family's name. "You hired bandits to murder him," Gunnar said, his voice deadly quiet. "I hired patriots to stop a spy," Bjorn replied, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Sigrid's anguished cry split the air like the sound of something breaking beyond repair. She pulled away from Gunnar's support, her legs somehow finding the strength to carry her across the room to where her eldest brother stood. For a moment, Gunnar thought she might strike him. Instead, she simply looked into his eyes with a grief so profound it seemed to drain all the warmth from the room. "He loved me," she whispered. "He was coming back for me, and you killed him for it. You murdered an innocent man and then buried me alive for loving him. He was going to take you away from us," Bjorn said desperately. "Away from everything we'd built, everything Father worked for. Father worked for happiness." Sigrid's voice rose to a shout that seemed to shake the very walls. "He worked for a family that loved and protected each other, not this monstrous thing you've turned us into." The amber necklace at her throat caught the firelight as she moved, each gleaming stone reflecting the tears that streamed down her face. It was a reminder of all the love she'd lost, first her mother, then her father, now Eric, and finally the brothers who'd chosen murder over mercy. Torkel cleared his throat awkwardly, still holding Eric's blood-stained cloak. "There's more," he said reluctantly. "Ragnar's men were boasting about it in the tavern at Cross Creek. Said Bjorn Bjornsson paid them well to make sure the Westfjord spy never reached his destination. The whole settlement knows what was done and who ordered it." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Not only had Bjorn arranged Eric's murder, but he'd been careless enough to let word spread. Soon, every community in the region would know that the Bjornsson family had resorted to hiring bandits to solve their problems. The very honor Bjorn had killed to protect was now irreparably stained with innocent blood. "You've destroyed us all," Olaf whispered, staring at his older brother as if seeing him for the first time. "Everything you did to preserve. Our reputation has made us outcasts." But Sigrid was no longer listening to her brother's recriminations. She had sunk to her knees beside the fire, clutching Eric's pendant in one hand and her mother's amber necklace in the other, keening with a grief that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Gunnar watched her pain with the recognition of someone who'd carried similar burdens. But beneath his sympathy, something harder was taking shape, a cold, implacable anger at the senseless waste of it all. 2 young people dead or destroyed, families torn apart, a community's faith shattered, all because one man couldn't accept that love sometimes crossed the boundaries others drew in blood and tradition. The time for talking was over. Now came the reckoning. The dawn that followed Torkel's terrible revelation came grey and cold, as if the sky itself mourned the innocence that had been lost in the darkness. Word of Eric's murder and Bjorn's involvement had spread through Nordheim like wildfire, carried by whispers that grew into accusations, then into demands for justice that could no longer be ignored. The village square filled early with people who'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of what they'd learned. Farmers abandoned their morning chores, fishermen left their nets unmended, and even the children sensed the weight of adult concerns that pressed down on their community like storm clouds heavy with rain. Astrid the Wise stood before the ancient trial circle stones, massive granite monoliths that had been old when her grandmother was young, carved with runes that spoke of justice and the prices it demanded. These stones had witnessed few trials in recent generations, but their presence in the village square served as a constant reminder that some matters could only be settled through formal combat and divine judgment. "By right of blood and tradition," Astrid announced, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "Gunnar, Eriksson demands trial by combat against Bjorn Bjornsson for the murder of Erik Thorson and the attempted murder of Sigrid Bjornsdottir." The formal words sent a ripple of tension through the assembly. Trial by combat was an ancient rite, rarely invoked but impossible to refuse when properly claimed. It would be single combat to the death or yield, with the gods themselves judging who spoke truth and who carried the weight of dishonor. Bjorn stood at the edge of the circle, his father's inherited sword gleaming in the pale morning light. Despite his guilt, despite the evidence of his crimes, he still carried himself with the arrogance of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. At 28, he was in the prime of his strength, fast and skilled with weapons, confident that youth and training would overcome whatever advantages Gunnar's experience might provide. "I accept the challenge," he declared loudly, his voice carrying across the square. "Let the gods judge between us and show this community who truly serves justice." Gunnar prepared for combat with the methodical care of a man who'd survived 3 decades of warfare. In his modest dwelling, away from the crowd's scrutiny, he donned the simple leather armor he'd worn on countless raids, scarred and patched but still sturdy, still capable of turning aside glancing blows. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as he checked each strap and buckle. His father's shield leaned against the wall, an ancient piece of linden wood and iron that bore the battle scars of generations of warriors. The shield was cracked down its center from some long-ago battle, but the crack had been reinforced with iron bands that made it stronger rather than weaker. It was a fitting metaphor, Gunnar thought, for what this day would require of him. Sigrid sat in the corner, watching his preparations with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. The amber necklace at her throat caught what little light filtered through the small windows, and her fingers worked constantly at Eric's wooden bear carving, as if the familiar motion could somehow bring him back to life. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You've already saved my life once. You don't owe me your own." Gunnar paused in his preparations, meeting her gaze with the steady calm that had carried him through countless battles. "This isn't just about you anymore," he replied gently. "It's about what kind of community we want to be, what kind of people we want our children to remember us as. But Bjorn is younger, faster, and I'm older, more experienced, and fighting for something that matters more than personal pride." Gunnar lifted the cracked shield, testing its weight and balance. "That counts for more than you might think." Outside, the crowd continued to grow as word spread to neighboring farms and settlements. People came not just to witness the combat, but to see how their community would handle this crisis of conscience. Would they stand by the old ways that demanded blood for honor, or would they find courage to question traditions that led to such senseless tragedy? Magnus and Olaf stood apart from their older brother, their faces reflecting the internal struggle that had consumed them since learning the full truth of what Bjorn had done. The younger brothers found themselves caught between loyalty to their blood and horror at the depths of deception and murder that loyalty had concealed. "He's still our brother," Magnus said to Olaf, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "Is he?" Olaf replied bitterly. "The brother I knew wouldn't have hired killers, wouldn't have let me help bury our sister alive while knowing her lover was already dead." Both young men bore the weight of their own participation in Sigrid's near execution. They'd acted on Bjorn's orders, trusting his judgment and his version of events. Now they understood they'd been manipulated as surely as Sigrid had been victimized, used as tools in their brother's campaign of lies and violence. Astrid moved between the sacred stones with reverent care, sprinkling blessed salt at each cardinal point and speaking the ancient words that would sanctify the coming combat. The ritual was old as winter, designed to ensure that whatever happened within the circle would carry the weight of divine judgment rather than mere human violence. "The trial stones have seen much over the centuries," she said to those gathered closest. "They've witnessed justice and injustice, truth and deception, courage and cowardice. Today they'll judge between a man who killed for pride and a man who fights for mercy." The crowd parted as Gunnar emerged from his dwelling, fully armed and ready for what might be his final battle. He moved with the measured pace of someone who'd made peace with his choices, his massive frame carrying the shield and sword that had served him faithfully through 3 decades of warfare. But it was Sigrid walking beside him that drew the most attention. She'd insisted on being present, on witnessing the combat that would either vindicate Eric's memory or see her protector die for defending her. The amber necklace gleamed at her throat, and she carried herself with a dignity that made her seem older than her 22 years. "Whatever happens," she said to Gunnar as they approached the circle, "I want you to know that you've already given me something precious. You've shown me that not all men solve their problems with cruelty, that there are still those who choose to protect rather than destroy." Gunnar nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. In a few moments, he would either prove that mercy could triumph over brutality, or he would die trying. But either way, the choice to fight had already changed something fundamental in their community's understanding of itself. The trial circle stones stood silent and impartial, weathered witnesses to human folly and human nobility in equal measure. Soon, they would echo with the clash of steel on steel, the grunts of mortal combat, the sound of one man's life ending or another's redemption beginning. As Gunnar stepped into the sacred circle, he felt the weight of all the lives he'd taken settling on his shoulders one final time. If he died today, at least it would be in service of life rather than death, protection rather than destruction. After 30 years of being a weapon in other men's hands, he would finally fight for something that mattered more than gold or glory, or the empty promises of warrior fame. Bjorn entered from the opposite side, his young face set in lines of determination and barely controlled rage. He'd spent the night convincing himself that he was the victim here, that Gunnar's interference had forced him into increasingly desperate measures. In his mind, he still fought for family honor and community traditions, not for the selfish pride that had driven him to murder and attempted fratricide. The morning sun broke through the clouds just as both men took their positions, painting the trial stones in shades of gold and shadow that seemed to emphasize the ancient weight of what was about to unfold. In moments, one of them would be dead or broken, and their community would have to live with the consequences of whichever truth the gods chose to reveal through blood and steel. Astrid raised her staff, its carved tip catching the sunlight like a torch in the gathering darkness of human consequence. "Let the trial begin," she declared, her voice carrying across the silent crowd like the tolling of a funeral bell. The time for words had ended. Now, only action remained. The first clash of steel rang across the village square like thunder announcing a storm. Bjorn came at Gunnar with the fury of youth and desperation, his father's sword cutting a silver arc through the morning air that would have taken the head from a lesser warrior. But Gunnar was no lesser warrior. The old raider's cracked shield intercepted the blow with a sound like breaking wood, the ancient iron reinforcements holding firm despite the tremendous force behind Bjorn's attack. The impact drove Gunnar back a step, his boots scraping against the packed earth within the sacred circle. But he absorbed the blow's energy with the practiced ease of someone who'd survived countless such exchanges. "First blood to experience," Astrid murmured to herself, watching from outside the circle as Gunnar immediately counterattacked with a measured thrust that forced Bjorn to give ground. The younger man's face showed surprise at the power behind Gunnar's response. Whatever doubts he might have harbored about his opponent's age-diminished capabilities vanished as the veteran's sword point whispered past his ribs, close enough to part the fabric of his tunic without breaking skin. Around the circle, the crowd watched in tense silence. This wasn't the brutal spectacle of gladiatorial combat, but something far more profound, a test of wills and principles played out through the ancient language of blade and shield. Every move carried meaning beyond mere technique, every exchange a statement about what kind of justice their community would embrace. Bjorn circled to his left, trying to force Gunnar to turn and expose his sword arm to attack. The strategy showed good tactical thinking, but Gunnar had been fighting skilled opponents since before Bjorn was born. He adjusted his stance smoothly, keeping his shield between them, while his sword moved in small, economical patterns that suggested vast reserves of controlled violence. "You're defending?" Bjorn called out, his breathing already showing the strain of sustained combat. "Afraid to attack an honorable warrior?" Gunnar didn't respond to the taunt. Words were wasted breath in serious combat, and every breath might be the difference between life and death when fighting someone 30 years younger. Instead, he let his actions speak, advancing with sudden, explosive speed that caught Bjorn off guard. The series of attacks that followed demonstrated exactly why Gunnar Eriksson had survived 3 decades of Viking raids. His sword moved like quicksilver, striking high then low, feinting left before cutting right, each blow part of a flowing combination that built pressure like storm waves against a crumbling cliff. Bjorn gave ground steadily, his father's sword working frantically to parry attacks that came from angles he couldn't predict. The younger man's superior speed meant nothing when he was constantly reacting rather than initiating, always. One step behind an opponent who fought like violence was a language he'd been speaking since childhood. The crowd could see the shift in momentum. What had begun as a contest between youth and experience was becoming a demonstration of why some men survived to grow old in a profession where most died young. Gunnar wasn't just fighting with his sword, he was fighting with his mind, using every lesson learned through decades of mortal combat. A particularly vicious overhand blow from Gunnar's sword shattered Bjorn's guard entirely, sending the younger man stumbling backward with his father's blade knocked wide and his defense in ruins. For a moment, the killing stroke was there, a clear path to Bjorn's unprotected throat that any warrior would have taken without hesitation. But Gunnar pulled the blow at the last second, stepping back rather than delivering the death that combat tradition demanded. The gesture sent a ripple of surprise through the watching crowd, and confusion across Bjorn's sweat-streaked face. "Why?" Bjorn gasped, his chest heaving from exertion and the adrenaline rush of barely avoided death. "Because I'm not fighting to kill you," Gunnar replied calmly, his own breathing steady despite the intense combat. "I'm fighting to stop you." The distinction seemed to infuriate Bjorn more than any killing blow could have. His face contorted with rage at what he perceived as condescension, at being spared like a child who'd overreached his abilities. "I don't need your mercy," he snarled, launching himself forward in a wild attack that sacrificed all technique for raw aggression. It was exactly what Gunnar had been waiting for. The old warrior's shield swept up to catch Bjorn's descending sword, while his own blade punched forward in a perfectly timed counter that found the gap in his opponent's desperate defense. Steel pierced flesh with a wet sound that carried clearly in the sudden silence. Bjorn's eyes went wide with shock and pain as Gunnar's sword point found the muscle of his sword arm, penetrating just deep enough to sever tendons without threatening life. The father's sword fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the stones with a finality that echoed like a funeral bell. Bjorn dropped to one knee, clutching his wounded arm while blood seeped between his fingers. "Yield," Gunnar said quietly, his sword point now resting against Bjorn's throat. "This doesn't have to end in death." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if pride would prove stronger than survival instinct. For long moments, Bjorn knelt in the circle with Gunnar's sword at his throat, blood dripping from his wounded arm onto the ancient stones. His face cycled through emotions, rage, pain, humiliation, and finally, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Around them, the crowd waited in breathless silence for his decision. "I yield," he whispered finally, the words barely audible but carrying clearly in the morning stillness. Gunnar immediately stepped back, lowering his weapon and offering his free hand to help the wounded man to his feet. But before Bjorn could accept the gesture, Sigrid's voice rang out across the square with a clarity that stopped everyone's hearts. "I forgive you." She stood at the edge of the sacred circle, Eric's wedding ring gleaming on her finger, the simple gold band that Torkel had found clutched in her lover's cold hand. She'd placed it there that morning as both memorial and symbol, a promise that love would outlast the hatred that had tried to destroy it. "I forgive you, Bjorn," she repeated, stepping into the circle despite tradition that forbade outsiders from entering during combat. "I forgive all of you." The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. This wasn't the angry condemnation they'd expected from someone who'd suffered so much injustice. This was something far more powerful and far more dangerous to their comfortable assumptions about justice and revenge. Magnus and Olaf stood frozen at the circle's edge, their faces reflecting the shock of hearing forgiveness where they'd expected and perhaps deserved hatred. They'd helped bury their sister alive, had participated in her attempted murder based on lies their brother had told them. By any measure, they deserved her condemnation. Instead, Sigrid approached each of them in turn, her movements graceful, despite the trauma she'd endured. To Magnus, the youngest, she offered a gentle touch on the cheek, the same gesture their mother had used to comfort him as a child. "You were frightened," she said softly. "Frightened of losing me, frightened of disappointing father's memory, frightened of being seen as weak. But fear doesn't have to make us cruel." To Olaf, she offered her hand, waiting patiently until he found the courage to take it. "We can choose differently from now on. We can choose to protect love instead of destroying it." But it was to Bjorn that she offered the greatest gift. Kneeling beside her wounded eldest brother, she helped him sit upright, her touch gentle on his injured arm, despite everything he'd done to her. "You killed Eric," she said simply. "You tried to kill me. You nearly destroyed our family and our community's faith in itself. But I won't let your choices poison the rest of my life. I won't become the bitter, vengeful person that such treatment might have made me." Bjorn stared at her through tears he couldn't control, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the extraordinary person his sister had always been. "How can you forgive me?" he asked brokenly. "After everything I've done?" "Because Eric taught me that love is stronger than hatred," Sigrid replied, her fingers touching the wedding ring she wore in his memory. "Because our mother taught me that family means finding ways to heal instead of ways to hurt. Because Gunnar showed me that even the most violent man can choose mercy when it matters most." The transformation in the crowd was visible, like ice breaking up on a frozen river when spring finally arrived. Faces that had been hard with anticipated justice softened into something approaching understanding. Children who'd been frightened by the morning's violence began to relax as they sensed the adults around them discovering new possibilities. Astrid the Wise stepped into the circle, her ancient face serene with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see wisdom triumph over folly. "The gods have spoken," she announced, her voice carrying across the square. Not through blade or blood, but through the courage to choose forgiveness over vengeance. She moved to where the father's sword lay forgotten on the stones, lifting the ancient weapon with hands that showed her respect for its history. "This blade has drawn blood in the service of pride and anger. Let it serve gentler purposes from now on." Bjorn accepted the sword when she offered it, but his grip was uncertain, as if he no longer knew what to do with a weapon that had been part of his identity for so long. The man who'd entered the circle so certain of his righteousness emerged confused and broken, but perhaps capable of becoming something better. Gunnar watched the reconciliation with quiet satisfaction, feeling something ease in his chest that had been tight for 30 years. This was what redemption looked like, not the dramatic gesture of a single heroic moment, but the slow, patient work of choosing mercy over revenge, understanding over condemnation, love over fear. The sacred stones of the trial circle had witnessed many things over the centuries, but perhaps none so powerful as the moment when a young woman chose to break the cycle of violence that had nearly consumed them all. As the crowd began to disperse, carrying news of what they'd witnessed to every corner of their community and beyond, Sigrid remained in the circle with her brothers, beginning the long, difficult work of rebuilding what hatred had torn apart. The morning's combat had ended not with death, but with the possibility of new life for them all. 6 months had passed since the trial by combat that changed everything, and Nordheim bore little resemblance to the rigid, fearful community it had once been. Where the old burial site had scarred the forest floor, wildflowers now grew in abundance, as if the earth itself had chosen to celebrate life over death, beauty over brutality. In the village square, a new stone had been placed among the ancient trial circle, not another monument to warfare and judgment, but something altogether different. Carved from smooth granite and polished to gleaming perfection, it bore simple words in the old script. Here mercy triumphed over vengeance, and love proved stronger than fear. The community gathering stone, as people had begun calling it, served as the focal point for a new tradition. Instead of settling disputes through violence or rigid adherence to ancient codes, the village now brought their conflicts here for discussion, mediation, and the kind of patient work that built understanding rather than resentment. Sigrid had become the heart of this transformation, no longer the frightened young woman who'd nearly died for loving the wrong person. She moved through the community with quiet authority, helping neighbors resolve their differences and teaching children that strength came from compassion rather than conquest. She still wore Eric's wedding ring, but now it was paired with her mother's amber necklace and a new addition, a small silver pendant shaped like clasped hands that Gunnar had commissioned from the village smith. It bore the inscription, "In memory of love that endures," and had become a symbol recognized throughout the region as a sign of Nordheim's commitment to choosing understanding over hatred. "Tell me about the old ways again," little Astrid asked, settling beside Sigrid on the bench near the community stone. The child had been named for the wise woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep just 2 months after the trial, leaving behind a legacy of gentleness that continued to guide the village's evolution. "The old ways taught us that some things were more important than happiness," Sigrid replied, her fingers working at a piece of embroidery that would become part of a wedding gift for a young couple planning to marry, despite coming from families with different customs. That tradition mattered more than individual choice, that family honor was worth any sacrifice. "But that was wrong, wasn't it?" the child asked, with the directness that only the very young could manage. "Not wrong exactly," Sigrid said carefully, "but incomplete. The old ways forgot that traditions are supposed to serve people, not the other way around. They forgot that honor without compassion is just another form of cruelty." From his workshop at the edge of the square, Gunnar looked up from the wooden cradle he was crafting for a family expecting their first child. His hands, once skilled only in dealing death, had discovered an unexpected talent for creating beautiful, useful things. The cradle would be his 15th this year, a small but meaningful contribution to a community that was literally growing beyond its ancient limitations. The battle-worn axe that had hung unused on his wall for so long now served as a woodworking tool, its sharp edge shaping furniture instead of taking lives. He'd offered to make weapons for those who needed them, but found fewer and fewer requests, as the village discovered alternatives to violence for solving their problems. Magnus approached the workshop, his young face bright with excitement. At 19, Bjorn's youngest brother had grown into a thoughtful leader, taking over much of the family farm's management while his older siblings worked through their own paths toward redemption. "The messenger from Cross Creek brought interesting news," Magnus announced, settling on a stool beside Gunnar's workbench. "3 more communities have requested mediators trained in our new methods. Apparently, word is spreading about what happened here." Gunnar smiled, remembering Astrid's prediction that their choice to embrace mercy over vengeance would echo far beyond their own village borders. Communities throughout the region were beginning to question traditions that demanded blood for honor. Families were finding ways to heal instead of continuing ancient feuds. "And Bjorn?" Gunnar asked quietly. Magnus's expression grew more complex. The eldest brother had struggled most with the aftermath of the trial, finding it difficult to rebuild his identity around something other than rigid adherence to warrior traditions. But slowly, painfully, he was learning to see strength in gentleness, courage in admitting mistakes. "He's been working with the families affected by Ragnar's bandits," Magnus replied, helping them rebuild what was destroyed, trying to make amends for the violence he unleashed. "It's slow work, but he's beginning to understand that real honor comes from helping rather than hurting." The sound of laughter drew their attention to the square, where Olaf was teaching a group of children the proper way to care for the new fruit trees the community had planted. The middle brother had discovered an unexpected gift for nurturing growing things, and his orchard was already being celebrated throughout the region for both its productivity and its beauty. As afternoon faded toward evening, the village settled into the peaceful rhythms that had replaced the constant tension of earlier times. Families gathered for meals without fear that ancient grudges might suddenly explode into violence. Young people courted across traditional boundaries, knowing their love would be celebrated rather than punished. Sigrid stood beside the community stone as the sun set, her fingers touching each of her symbolic artifacts. In turn, Eric's ring for the love that had inspired everything, her mother's necklace for the wisdom that endured, Gunnar's pendant for the compassion that made change possible. "Do you think he would be proud of what we've built?" she asked Gunnar as he joined her in the gathering dusk. The old warrior considered the question carefully, his weathered face peaceful in the fading light. Around them, the village hummed with the quiet contentment of people who'd learned to choose love over fear, understanding over judgment, mercy over vengeance. "I think," he said finally, "Eric would be amazed that one act of love could change so many lives, that his death, as terrible as it was, somehow planted seeds that grew into something beautiful." Sigrid smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart like warm honey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose compassion over cruelty, new chances to prove that love really could be stronger than hatred. But tonight, in the peaceful village they'd helped create, it was enough to simply stand beside the community stone and remember that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through violence, but through the patient, persistent choice to forgive.